Hello, this is Mad Pistol, and I am making a video about my Phenom II X4 processor. More specifically, I'm making a video about how to properly optimize it. A lot of people, obviously, for the last several years have been comparing the i7s to the Phenom 2s, and while the i7s are definitely the more powerful processors, as far as it goes for gaming, they're actually pretty close as far as modern day games go. So basically, what this video is going to be, it's going to be about showing you the difference between an overclocked processor, an overclocked Phenom 2, and an optimized overclocked Phenom 2. So if you look up here, I currently have my CPU set at 3.8 gigahertz. There's a little bit of a discrepancy here because of I guess the front side bus. It's showing 3825, but it's actually just 3.8. So what I have here is I've just pushed up the multiplier to 19. I still have the North Bridge set at 200 megahertz at a 10x multiplier, so it's at 2000 megahertz. I have the HT set at 2000 megahertz as well, so that's at stock. And then I also have the memory set at 1333 excuse me, 1333 megahertz, so that basically everything's at stock at this point. Left the timings fairly loose so that we wouldn't have any problems with stability. So that's what we have so far. And I've also pulled up a copy of Cinebench 11.5. The reason I've done this is because it's a good way of measuring the performance of CPUs against each other, and it's also pretty impartial. It's good for AMD and also Intel. One of the things you'll notice though is that it can handle, I think, up to 64 threads, and because of that, Intel CPUs, specifically the i7s that have hyperthreading on each of their 4 cores, actually benefit a little bit better, since the Phenom 2s do not have any sort of extra threading involved, so it only has 4 threads total. So that's the reason why the i5 and i7 seem to get a little bit better performance per clock. Well, and they're faster per clock as well. It takes a higher speed Phenom to match an i7. So here's what I'm going to do. Like I said, the settings, it's at 3.8 gigahertz, 200 megahertz times 10 for the North Bridge, and the memory is at 1333 megahertz. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run Cinebench 11.5, and we're going to see the results we get. I'm going to show you how to properly, I'm going to tell you about properly optimizing your Phenom 2, specifically your quad core. So I will be back in about 2 seconds. And we're back. So here's what's happened. We have run Cinebench for Phenom 2 X4, 3.8 gigahertz, and we have gotten a score of 4.40. That is for 1333 megahertz memory, 2000 megahertz North Bridge clock. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to restart my computer. I'm going to go into the BIOS. I'm going to set the North Bridge from 2000 megahertz up to 2600 megahertz, and I'm going to do this by increasing the North Bridge multiplier by 10, or from 10 to 13. This will effectively increase the North Bridge clock to 2600 megahertz. So I'm going to go do that, and when we get back, we will see if it makes a difference. And we're back again. So now I have increased the North Bridge from 2000 to 2600 megahertz. I've done this by bumping up the multiplier from 10x to 13x. So you can't really see it in CPU-Z right here. It still says 200 megahertz because that is the bus speed, but it is now the 13x multiplier. The multiplier for the core is exactly the same, the core speed. The HT link, I haven't changed that either. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run Cinebench again, see if it gets, see what kind of a score we get now we've increased the North Bridge from 2000 to 2600 megahertz. See you again in about 2 seconds. Okay, we've run Cinebench, and we've come back with a score of 4.5. That's a tenth of a point increase just from increasing the front side bus. I haven't done anything. I haven't, to the core speed, it's still exactly the same, but I've increased the North Bridge to 2600 megahertz from 2000 megahertz, and look at that, it's actually yielded higher performance. Now I've got one more step in the equation, which is memory, because memory still right now is at 1333 megahertz. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the memory to 1600 megahertz. We're going to see if that makes a difference in the overall score. So I'm going to restart my computer, do that, and I will see you again in just a second. And we're back. The change I've made is I've increased the memory up to 1600 megahertz. Look over here at CPU-Z. Now you can see it's at 800 megahertz. That's double pumped, so therefore it's going to be 1600 megahertz. Left the timings exactly the same, so we won't have any sort of stability errors or any problems with that. So now we're back over at the CPU, and it's 3.8 gigahertz still. I've still got the North Bridge set at 2600 megahertz. So now we're going to run Cinebench 11.5. We're going to see if it makes any difference. Be back in a second. Okay, so we've run the benchmark, and now we're back. I'm actually a little surprised because in the initial runs I've actually run it, it's come back to be about a few hundredths of a point higher whenever you increase the memory. I guess there are a few variables to go into this as to whether it performs better or not, but it actually scored exactly the same as just increasing the North Bridge up to 2600 megahertz. Like I said, I'm a little surprised by that, but we're going to go ahead and go with it. So that's the result. So basically, what have I done? Just as a small recap, well, for optimizing your AMD overclock, there's two major things that comes into play. That is your North Bridge and your memory speed. Most of the time, if you have a higher speed North Bridge, it means that the data is going to get passed around from the CPU to the graphics card and various other parts of the computer faster. Because of that, it actually makes the computer more responsive. Now, I can't really demonstrate the computer being more responsive right now. That's something you'd have to feel for yourself, but it does actually make the computer feel more responsive. The issue arises when you're trying to up the North Bridge of getting it stable, and I've actually found by trial and error and also reading several different forums on the internet that you actually have to increase the North Bridge voltage in order to be able to get it stable. If you don't, you're just going to get random crashes at higher frequencies, and you're not going to have any clue why. It's always a good idea to test each of the different components, memory, North Bridge, and CPU, and test the different clocks. Test them separately, so that way you can verify if they're stable or if they're not, if they need to be toned back or the voltage needs to be upped, or anywho. So that's the results right there. Now, in order to get the North Bridge up to 2600 megahertz from 2000 megahertz, I had to increase the North Bridge voltage from a stock of 1.1 volts up to 1.25 volts. Now, normally this isn't a bad thing, it doesn't really do much, but know that that will increase the heat output on the CPU, and if you increase the voltage on the North Bridge too much, it could potentially short out and destroy your CPU. Remember that. The North Bridge is actually on chip for this for the Phenom IIs, as it has been with the old Athlon 64s. So you now have both the memory controller and the North Bridge actually on chip, and because of that, it does directly affect the heat output of the processor. So make sure that if you're going to increase the processor up to a high frequency and also the North Bridge up to a high frequency, make sure you've got a pretty beefy heatsink to go along with it. So that about wraps it up. So that's the critical components that you need to have for being able to get the most out of your Phenom II quad-core overclock. You need to have a high core clock, a high core speed. If you have a black edition, you can do that via the multiplier. You need to have a good North Bridge speed. 2000 megahertz is stock. I recommend upping it up to 2600, 2800, or 2800 megahertz, depending on if your motherboard can handle it and your CPU. And then also memory. A lot of people think that 1333 megahertz memory is enough. I'm here to tell you that it makes a difference. Having tangible results and benchmarks is one thing, but being able to actually feel it in games and in desktop is another thing completely. So anyway, but like I said, that about wraps it up. You can read the specs in my comment, and I will have more videos on other things later on. So thanks for watching.